They dragged her through the snow in the dark. Before the sun had any chance to witness what they were doing, Gerald Whitmore held one arm. His brother Victor held the other. Clara couldn't feel her feet anymore. She'd stopped being able to feel them somewhere around the barn. And the twins were screaming in the flour sack Victor had slung over one shoulder like he was carrying grain to a storehouse. Two babies, screaming, and the men didn't even flinch. "Please," Clara said. She'd said it so many times by then that the word had lost its shape in her mouth. "Please, they'll die. It's too cold. Victor, they'll die out here." Victor set the sack down against the fence post without looking at her. The way you'd set down a bag of feed. Gerald was already tying the rope around her wrists. "That's not our concern anymore," he said. She'd thought, even then, even at that moment with the rope cutting into her skin and the wind coming down off the mountain like something furious and alive, she'd thought that he would stop, that something human in him would surface at the last second. She'd lived in that family's house for 4 years. She'd cooked at that family stove. She'd watched Gerald's face at her husband Thomas's funeral, and she'd thought she'd seen grief there, something genuine. She understood now that what she'd seen was calculation. He tied a second knot, tested it with a sharp tug that wrenched her shoulders back. Then he stepped away and didn't look at her again. The babies cried for a long time after the men's footsteps disappeared back toward the house. Then the cold got to them, and the crying went quieter, and that silence was the most terrible thing Clara Whitmore had ever heard in her life. If you've ever asked yourself what you would do, if you were the last chance someone had, then stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel and follow every part, because what happens next will test everything you think you know about what ordinary people are capable of. Hit the like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Ethan Calloway woke that morning the way he woke every morning, with the particular awareness of a man who has lived alone long enough that silence itself has a texture. He lay still for a moment in the dark of the cabin, listening to the wind work its way through the gaps in the south wall. He kept meaning to pack better, and he ran through his mental inventory the way he always did. Water barrel, wood supply, the gray mare's left foreleg that had been tender since Tuesday. He was a man who kept his world small and knowable on purpose. He'd learned the hard way that anything beyond arm's reach had a way of going wrong. He was 41 years old, and he had been on this particular stretch of Wyoming land for 15 years. He'd come up here after things he didn't talk about. A marriage that collapsed before it could properly fail, a younger brother's death that Ethan had not handled well, a general sense that the world with other people in it was more than he could reliably manage. The land had suited him. It was honest in the way that people rarely were. When winter came, it tried to kill you directly. There was something Ethan found almost restful in that. He pulled on his boots in the dark, got the stove going, and stepped outside to check the sky. The storm had moved through overnight and left the world scrubbed and white and very still. The cold had a particular quality to it that morning, not brutal the way it got in deep January, but sharp, the kind that got inside your collar and stayed there. He stood on the porch and looked out at the tree line and the long slope of snow coming down from the north pasture, and he thought about what needed doing and in what order. That was when he heard it. He almost didn't register it at first. His brain tried to categorize the sound as an animal, a fox maybe, or something smaller caught in a drift. He stood without moving and listened, and the sound came again, and his brain gave up trying to make it into something simpler. That was a child. He was off the porch before he'd made any conscious decision about it. He crossed the yard and went through the gate in the fence and started up the long slope toward the north pasture where the sound seemed to be coming from. And he told himself it was probably nothing. Probably some traveler's livestock had gotten loose, and he was going to feel foolish when he found a cold calf bawling in the snow. He kept telling himself that until he crested the small rise near the old property line fence and stopped. Clara Whitmore had been conscious for maybe 20 minutes by then. She'd come back to herself in stages. First just pain, then cold so complete it had almost stopped being painful and started being something else, something that felt almost like being swallowed. Her hands were numb past her wrists. She couldn't turn her head to see the twins because of the angle of the rope, but she could hear them. One of them, anyway. The other had gone quiet. When she heard footsteps in the snow, she thought for one long, disorienting second that Gerald had come back, that he'd thought better of it, and she felt something pathetic and humiliating move through her. Relief, actual relief at the thought of Gerald Whitmore coming back. And then a man came around the fence post, and he was not Gerald. He was taller than Gerald, and his coat was the wrong color, and he stopped when he saw her with an expression she couldn't quite read, because her vision was doing something strange at the edges. "There are babies," she said. Her voice didn't sound like her voice. "There are 2 babies, please." Ethan had already seen them. He'd seen them the moment he cleared the post. 2 small shapes bundled in cloth and tucked against the base of the fence, and one of them was moving and making that sound, and one of them was very still. He went to the still one first, crouched down, got 2 fingers against the side of its neck, and felt the thin flutter of a pulse there, and he said something under his breath that was neither a curse nor a prayer but existed in the space between. "They're alive," he said. "Both of them." "My hands," Clara said. He straightened up and looked at her properly then. He'd been a man who'd seen bad things, and he recognized what the rope had done to her wrists, and his jaw tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He took out his knife and cut the rope in 2 strokes, and she made a sound when the tension released that he felt somewhere in the middle of his chest. She tried to stand and couldn't. Her legs had been folded under her for too long in the cold, and they wouldn't answer, and Ethan caught her before she went face first into the snow. He wasn't a graceful man. He hadn't touched another human being, and he didn't let himself finish that particular calculation. He just held her upright with one arm and crouched back down and picked up both babies against his chest with the other. And they were so small that he could hold them both with one arm, and one of them had started crying again, which he decided to take as a good sign. "Can you walk if I hold you?" Clara looked at him. Her face was the color of old ash. "I don't know." "That's honest," he said. "Let's find out." It took them a long time to get back to the cabin. Clara could walk, barely, with Ethan's arm under hers and the babies pressed against him with his other arm. She fell twice, and he hauled her up both times without comment, and she didn't apologize because she didn't have the air for it. The wind picked up about halfway back, and she started shaking in a way that was different from before, deep and rhythmic and out of her control. And he said, "That's actually better, the shaking. Keep doing that." "I'm not doing it on purpose," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it means you're warming up, means your body's still fighting." She didn't say anything to that. She just focused on getting her legs to work and getting through the next few steps, and then the next few steps after that. When they finally got inside the cabin and he kicked the door shut behind them, the warmth of the stove hit her like something physical, and her knees went, and she ended up on the floor. He laid the babies down on the cot against the wall, and then came back and helped her up and onto the chair near the stove, and he wrapped a blanket around her shoulders that smelled like wood smoke and something else, something almost like pine. "I needed to check the children," he said. "Yes," she said. "Please." He was thorough about it. He unwrapped them and checked each one with a care that surprised her. Fingers checking pulse, checking color, checking whether they'd been frostbitten past recovery. His hands were rough and large, and he handled the babies with a concentrated gentleness that looked effortful, like something he was working at, not something that came naturally. One of the twins had a patch of white on the tip of one ear that he looked at for a long time. The other seemed physically all right, just cold and angry about it. "The small one with the fair hair," he said, without turning around. "What's her name?" Clara felt something shift in her chest. "Iris." "And the other one?" "Rose." He nodded once, like he was filing this information away. "Iris's ear might be a problem, but she's got good color otherwise, and she's breathing right, and she's not glassy-eyed, so I think she'll keep. I've seen worse come through," he paused, "on livestock. But the principle's the same." "All right," Clara said, because she didn't know what else to say. He heated water and made her drink it, and he cut up some cold biscuits from the morning and put them in front of her. And he did all of this in a way that was functional and matter-of-fact and without any excess of sympathy, which somehow made it easier to receive than sympathy would have been. She ate a little. She drank. She sat with the blanket around her shoulders and watched the man move around his small cabin and tried to understand what had just happened to her. His name was Ethan. He told her that when she asked, like it was a minor administrative detail. He didn't ask her name back right away, which she found she was grateful for. She wasn't ready to explain herself yet. She wasn't sure she was capable of it. Her brain kept trying to go back to the fence post and the snow and the sound of Victor's boots going away in the dark. And she kept pulling it back because she needed to stay present and functional, and she could feel the edge of something very large and very dark waiting for her if she lost her footing for even a moment. "Where are we?" she asked. He looked at her like the question was slightly unexpected. "Callaway Land, about 9 miles north of Dunmore." She'd never heard of Dunmore. She'd grown up in Nebraska and come west with Thomas, and she didn't know this country well. Thomas had always been the one who knew where things were. "Is there a town nearby?" "Dunmore's the nearest, 15 miles by road, more like 9 if you cut through the Harlan Pass, but you can't do that in winter." "Could you get a doctor?" He looked at her. "Today?" She looked at the babies on the cot. Rose was asleep, or something close to it. Iris was awake and making small sounds. "I don't know how badly they need one. I don't know much about babies." Her voice caught on the last word, and she stopped and pressed her lips together. He looked at them too. I don't either, honestly, but I've done some rough veterinary work and their breathing looks right to me. Responsive. No obvious injury." He paused. Is there something wrong that I should know about? Something that happened before?" "They were born 4 days ago," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, I'll go for the doctor in the morning if you think they need it. Tonight, we keep them warm and watch them." "You do that." It wasn't quite a question. He looked at her, not unkindly, and said, "They're on my land. That makes them my problem." It was the most practical thing anyone had ever said to her, and she sat with it for a moment, and then she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears, quiet and exhausted, running down her face. He didn't say anything. He didn't move closer or offer comfort. He just let her cry and kept tending the stove, and she found that she didn't actually mind that. There was something in it that felt like respect. She fell asleep in the chair. She didn't mean to. One moment she was watching the firelight move across the logs on the wall, and the next she was waking up with her neck stiff and the cabin dark except for the low orange glow of the stove. And for a terrible second she didn't know where she was, and she grabbed for the blanket and knocked it to the floor and made a sound. The man, Ethan, was at the table. He'd been reading, or trying to. He looked up when she made the sound and just said, "You're inside. You're warm. The babies are fine." She put her face in her hands and breathed. "Sorry," she said when she'd gotten herself together. "Don't be," he said, and went back to his book. She stayed in the chair and watched him for a while. He had a quality she noticed over the next hour. A stillness that wasn't empty, the kind that came from someone who had been alone long enough that they'd made a kind of peace with themselves. He moved through his space without friction. Everything had its place. There was nothing random or thoughtless about the way he lived, and she understood without being told that this was how a person survived 15 years alone in a place like this. You made yourself into something efficient. You cut away anything that wasn't necessary. She wondered what he'd cut away to get here. Around what she guessed was midnight, Rose woke up hungry and unhappy about it, and the sound woke Iris, and for about 15 minutes the cabin was full of a particular kind of chaos that Clara navigated with the mechanical competence of someone doing something hard for the very first time and not allowing themselves to think about the doing of it. When she got them both settled again, she looked up and Ethan was watching her from across the room with an expression she couldn't read. "You manage," he said. "I have to," she said. "That's not the same thing as able. Some people have to and still can't." She looked at him. She was very tired and her wrists hurt, and she'd lost track of when she'd last slept properly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you manage," he said. "That's all." It was, she realized, something like a compliment. She didn't quite know what to do with that. In the morning she told him her name and something of what had happened. Not all of it. Not yet. She didn't have the words yet. But the shape of it. Thomas's death. The Whitmore family's reaction to the twins being girls. The way Gerald had looked at her over the dinner table for 3 weeks before anything was said. That particular look that she should have recognized for what it was, and hadn't, because she'd trusted Thomas's family to be trustworthy. Ethan listened to all of this without interrupting. He had a quality of attention that was slightly different from most people's. He listened like he was actually taking the information in and doing something with it, rather than just waiting for his turn to respond. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The Whitmore family," he said. "Thomas Whitmore out of Cheyenne." She looked at him. "You know them." "I know of them. Everybody in this part of the territory knows of them." He poured himself more coffee, poured some for her without asking. They've got range running from here to the state line. Gerald Whitmore's been buying up water rights for the last 5 years, not always in ways people thought were entirely legitimate. Thomas didn't... She stopped. Thomas wasn't like that. I didn't say he was. He set the coffee in front of her. I'm saying the family you're describing matches the family I've heard of. And the family I've heard of is not a family that's going to accept having a problem they thought they'd solved turn up alive. She'd known this. She'd known it since she woke up in the snow to the sound of her daughter crying. She'd been holding the knowledge at arm's length because looking at it directly felt like more than she could manage. I don't have anywhere to go, she said. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to. I know that too. She looked at him across the table. He was looking at his coffee. He had a face that had been weathered into something honest, not particularly kind in the soft sense, but solid, the kind of face you could take a reading from. She'd been wrong about faces before. She'd thought she could read Gerald's face, and she'd been wrong. She was careful now about trusting her own perceptions. Why did you come up there this morning? She asked. He looked up. I heard something. You could have decided it was an animal. I could have, he agreed. Why didn't you? He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which was not what she'd expected. I don't know that I made a decision, he said finally. I just went. She nodded. She understood that. She'd made most of the important decisions in her life in that same way. Not through deliberation, but through a kind of motion, a going toward or a going away from something before the thinking could catch up and complicate things. The day settled around them with a kind of uneasy domesticity. She tended to the twins. He went out and did whatever it was that a man with a ranch to run did in the morning. She could hear him moving around in the yard, the sound of the axe, the gray mare making her opinion known about something. He came back for the midday meal and they ate in a silence that was not quite comfortable but was no longer uncomfortable. And she thought about how strange it was that a person could be sitting at a table with someone they'd known for less than a day and already have moved past the anxious kind of silence into something more ordinary. In the afternoon, he went out again, and she was alone with the twins and the cabin and the particular quality of winter light coming through the small window. And she let herself think about it for the first time. The fence post, the rope, the sound of the twins crying when she couldn't do anything about it. She sat with it, and she felt it, and she let the full weight of what the Whitmore family had done to her settle into her bones. Not to break her, but to give her something to carry. Something real. Because she knew, with the clarity that sometimes came after the worst things, that she was going to need that weight. She was going to need to remember exactly what had been done and exactly who had done it. Not because it would make her bitter. She was afraid of bitterness. She'd seen what it did to people. But because there was a reckoning coming, and she intended to be standing upright when it arrived. She heard Ethan come back in, heard him knock the snow off his boots, heard the stove door open and the particular sound of wood being added. They sleep? He asked. Finally, she said. He came and looked at the twins for a moment with that same concentrated look he'd had the morning before. The ear looks better, he said about Iris. I think so, Clara said. He nodded. He went to the table. I was about to sit down when he stopped and turned back to face her, and there was something in his expression that was careful, measured, like he'd been rehearsing what he was about to say and still wasn't sure of it. You can stay, he said, until you figure out what's next. I'm not going to put you out. Clara looked at him. That might be dangerous for you. If they come looking. I know. They will come looking. I expect so. And you're on my land, he said again. That makes you my concern. If you want to go somewhere, I'll help you go somewhere. But if you need to stay until you can work out what that somewhere is, then stay. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't understand why you do that. He looked at her steadily. Because they tied you to a fence post in the middle of winter with your newborn children and walked away, he said, and I don't need a reason beyond that. She looked at him for a long time. Outside the wind had picked up again and she could hear it moving around the corners of the cabin, testing things the way wind always did in winter, looking for weakness, looking for a way in. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and sat down at the table and picked up his book, and Clara turned back to the cot where her daughters were sleeping, and the fire held, and the wind did not find a way in. But she knew. with a certainty that sat quietly in her chest like a stone she'd been given to carry, that the worst of what was coming had not arrived yet. Gerald Whitmore was not a man who let problems stay unsolved. Victor was not a man who accepted loose ends. She looked at Iris and Rose, their small chests rising and falling in the firelight, and she made herself a promise. Whatever was coming, she was going to be ready for it. She just hoped this quiet, strange, careful man understood what he'd signed up for when he went up that hill and followed the sound. She suspected, somehow, that he did. 3 days passed before Clara stopped flinching every time the cabin door opened. She didn't realize she was doing it until the third morning, when Ethan came in from the yard and stamped the snow off his boots, and she felt her shoulders go up toward her ears before she could stop them. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it, just hung his coat on the peg and moved past her to the stove. But she caught the slight pause before he'd reached for the door handle, the way he'd started knocking before he came in, something she was almost certain he hadn't done before. That was the kind of man he was turning out to be. He made adjustments without announcing them. The twins were eating better. Iris's ear had come back from white to pink to something almost normal, and both girls had stopped the thin, anxious crying of the first nights and moved into a more robust and demanding version that Clara found, strange as it seemed, genuinely reassuring. Hungry was better than cold. Angry was better than still. She'd set up a kind of system with the cot, propping the twins at opposite ends so they could be checked without moving the other, and she'd commandeered one of Ethan's extra shirts to make a kind of bolster between them. He'd looked at the shirt when he first noticed it, repurposed this way. Looked at it for just a second, and then looked away and said nothing, and she'd filed that moment away in the growing catalog she was keeping of Ethan Calloway's tells. He didn't have many, but he had them. He slept on the floor by the stove, insisting on it with a stubbornness that was mild in tone and entirely immovable in practice. The first night she'd argued, and he'd listened to her argue and then laid down his bedroll on the floor anyway. She'd given up. She'd learned already that he had a particular quality of quiet persistence that was more effective than argument. He just stayed in his position the way the mountain stayed in its position, not threatening, not explaining itself, simply remaining. It made her trust him slightly more than was probably wise. She'd known Thomas for a full year before she married him, and she'd been wrong about him in small ways that had added up. She'd known Gerald for 4 years, and had apparently understood almost nothing about him. She was not confident in her ability to read people, but she watched Ethan anyway, because watching was what she had. On the 4th day, he came in from the north field with a particular set to his jaw that she'd started to recognize as the look he wore when something had registered with him that he hadn't expected. "Tracks," he said, pulling off his gloves. She went still. "How far?" "Edge of the property. Up by the Harlan Ridge line." He didn't look at her, was looking at his hands, flexing them against the cold. "2 horses. They came up along the tree line and stopped. Didn't come onto the property. But they were looking. They were looking." She sat down in the chair because her legs felt suddenly unreliable. Rose was on the cot, awake, and conducting a serious investigation of her own fingers. Iris was asleep, normal, ordinary things, the kind of things that could be taken away in an afternoon. "How long do you think we have?" Clara asked. Ethan thought about it, actually thought about it. The way she'd come to understand was his habit, not rushing to make her feel better with an answer that wasn't true. "Depends on what they saw. If they just confirmed you were alive and somewhere on this land, they'll go back to Gerald and Gerald will plan something. That takes time. If they've already planned—" He stopped. "Then not long," she said. "Then not long," he agreed. She looked at him. He was at the table now, had poured himself coffee, and was holding the cup without drinking from it, staring at a point somewhere past the wall. She'd learned this too. It was how he thought. He went somewhere behind his eyes when he was working something out. "You should know what you're dealing with," she said. He focused back on her. "Tell me." So she told him the parts she'd held back before, not because she'd been hiding them exactly, but because the first telling had been enough. The shape of the thing, the worst night of it. This was the older, longer story, and it took her a while to find her way into it. She told him about Thomas. He'd been a good man, she said, and she meant it, but he'd been a man who believed his family was what he thought it was, rather than what it actually was. He'd grown up in the Whitmore household, and the Whitmore household had taught him that Gerald was a businessman, and Victor was difficult but manageable, and their father had built something worth being proud of. Thomas had believed all of that. He'd had a gift for belief. Claire had loved that about him once and found it frightening later, and now, at this remove, felt something complicated and unresolvable about it that she didn't have a word for. She told him about the land. Thomas had inherited 2,000 acres outright from his mother's side, separate from the main Whitmore holdings. And when he died without sons, that was how Gerald had said it, standing at the grave in his good coat, without sons. Those 2,000 acres had become a question. Clara had assumed they went to her. The papers Thomas had left said they went to her, but the Whitmore family had a lawyer in Cheyenne who also did work for the territorial court. And within 6 weeks of Thomas's death, there were questions being raised about the validity of the deed, about whether Thomas's signature on the amended will had been his signature, about whether Clara had exerted what the lawyer's letter called undue influence. Ethan's expression shifted when she said that. They tried to contest the will. They contested the will, she said. They got a judge to put a stay on the land transfer. I was still in the house then, Thomas's house, our house, and Gerald came to me and said I could stay and the whole business would go away quietly if I signed the land over to the family trust. He was very calm about it, very reasonable. What did you say? I said I'd think about it. She paused. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't have money for a lawyer. I didn't have anyone in that territory who wasn't connected to the Whitmore family in some way. I was also 6 months pregnant and not sleeping and trying to understand a legal document that had been written to be impossible to understand. So I said I'd think about it, and I thought about it for 2 weeks, and then I wrote to my aunt in Nebraska asking if she could recommend someone, and I think Gerald found out about the letter. That's when things changed. That's when things changed. She didn't go into the detail of the 3 weeks before the night at the fence. She gave him the outline, the way the household staff had stopped making eye contact with her. The small deprivations that were too small to name but added up to something she could feel pressing on her from all sides. Meals that were slightly wrong, fires that were allowed to go low, a lock on the outside of her bedroom door that appeared one morning without explanation. Gerald had been polite through all of it. He'd always been polite. That was the thing she kept returning to. He had a talent for cruelty that wore politeness as its outside coat, and she'd walked around inside it for weeks before she'd fully understood what she was inside. The twins came early, she said. 6 weeks. The midwife was... Gerald approved her. She was someone he trusted. I was told afterward that Gerald had been informed of the birth before I was fully conscious. She looked at her hands. I had 2 days. Then one night Victor came to the room and I understood from the way he came in that this was it. That whatever they'd planned was happening now. The cabin was very quiet. Outside the wind had dropped and the afternoon had gone gray and still in the way that sometimes meant more snow. The land, Ethan said. The 2,000 acres. Where does it sit? She told him. East of the main Whitmore holdings, running down to the Greer River. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that's water access. Yes. The Whitmore family doesn't have reliable water access on their eastern range. I know, because I've heard Gerald Whitmore's been trying to buy out the Greer River property holders for 3 years, and everyone he's approached has refused him. Clara looked at him. So the land isn't just 2,000 acres, Ethan said. It's water rights. It's the difference between a ranch that can expand and a ranch that's already hit its limit. He set down his coffee cup. Clara, this isn't about you. I mean, it started about you because you were there, and women like you are easy to discard when you're in the way. But this is about the land. This is about what happens to the Whitmore operation if those 2,000 acres go to someone outside the family and that someone eventually decides to sell the water rights to someone the Whitmore family can't control. She'd understood this in a dim way before. She was not a foolish woman, but hearing it laid out plainly did something to the thing she'd been carrying. It made it bigger and more solid. It gave it a kind of terrible logic that had previously felt incomprehensible. They'd tried to kill her and her daughters over water access to a river. They'll claim I'm a problem of sentiment, she said slowly. That Gerald was too attached to his brother's memory to be practical. That Victor was cleaning up a mess. That's how they'll tell the story. Probably, Ethan said. And you're holding the woman they tried to dispose of, on land that sits 20 miles from the eastern edge of the property they want. That's about the size of it, he said. Ethan. She said his name for the first time, and it felt different from how she'd expected, more formal somehow than what their actual situation warranted. You need to understand what that means for you. The Whitmore family doesn't need to prove anything. They have a lawyer and a judge, and men willing to be hired, and a story that can be shaped. You're a man alone out here. If they decide you're in the way, I know what I am, he said. I've been managing this land by myself for 15 years. I know my position. Then you know they could ruin you. He looked at her directly, and for the first time she saw something in his face that wasn't calm exactly, but wasn't anxiety either. It was something older than either of those things, something that had been tested before. Clara, he said, I've been ruined.
Ruined. I know what that looks like. I'm not afraid of it the way you'd think. She didn't know what to say to that. She didn't ask what had ruined him before. She stored the fact of it. The snow came that night, heavy and serious, the kind that meant business, and by morning the world had reorganized itself into white and gray, and the tracks Ethan had found on the ridge were buried, and the ranch felt sealed in, protected, a thing in a snow globe. It was illusory, Clara knew, but she let herself feel it anyway for one morning. Ethan spent the storm days doing repairs inside the cabin. There was always something, a board that needed reseating, a hinge that had gotten wrong, the south wall gaps that he finally got around to packing with a mixture of clay and straw that he explained to no one in particular as he worked. He talked more than she'd expected when he was working with his hands. Not about himself, not about anything personal. He'd talk about the repair he was doing, or about the ranch, or about weather patterns he'd noticed over the years. It was like the physical occupation of his hands freed something in him that silence usually held closed. She started asking him questions, not the personal ones she actually wanted to ask. Not yet. She wasn't sure they'd earned that with each other, but practical ones. About the land. About Dunmore. About who the Whitmore family had dealings with in this part of the territory. He answered all of them with the same quality of attention he gave everything. On the second snow day, she asked about the gray mare. What happened to her leg? He looked up from the hinge he was working on. She got it caught in a fence wire last month. I got there late. The cut healed, but there's scar tissue. Will she be all right? She'll be all right. She won't be what she was. Does that bother you? He thought about it. Some. She's a good horse. She was better before. He turned back to the hinge. But she's still useful. She doesn't know she's diminished. She just goes. Clara thought about that for a while. On the third snow day, Rose smiled for the first time. Or something that might have been a smile. It was early for smiling, probably it was just gas. But it looked enough like a smile that Clara made a sound she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. Something bright and involuntary. Ethan was across the room. He looked up. Rose, Clara said, and she was embarrassed by how her voice sounded, too full of something, and she cleared her throat. I think she smiled. He crossed the room and looked at the baby on the cot. Rose had gone back to her usual expression of serious, slightly suspicious evaluation of the world. He said. It might have been nothing. Might have been, he agreed, but he stayed where he was for a moment, looking at Rose, looking back at him, and something moved across his face that was brief and difficult to name and then was gone. He went back to the hinge. That night she lay awake listening to the snow settle and thinking about Thomas, which she hadn't let herself do properly in the weeks before everything broke. She'd been so focused on the practical problem of surviving his family that she'd had to keep Thomas himself in a box in some back room of her mind, sealed and untouched. She thought about him now, about his laugh, which had been enormous and slightly embarrassing in public places, about the way he'd touch the back of her hand sometimes across a dinner table, not a grand gesture, just a placement, a checking in. About the morning he'd told her the twins were coming, and the look on his face had been so purely happy that she'd felt it as almost painful to witness, that much uncomplicated joy in a grown man's face. She missed him. She'd been so occupied with surviving what his family had done that she'd almost forgotten to miss him. Remembering it now hurt in a way that felt almost healthy, like the hurt of a joint that had gone stiff and was finally being used again. She was thinking about this when she heard Ethan shift on his bedroll. She thought he was asleep, but then he said, in a voice that was quiet and not sleepy at all, Clara. I'm awake, she said. I know, that's why I said it. He paused. I've been thinking about the lawyer situation.
She turned her head toward the sound of his voice. She couldn't see him in the dark. What about it? You said you didn't have one before. I still don't. There's a man in Dunmore. Name's Aldous Heck. He does land law mostly, property disputes, that kind of thing. He's not fancy, but he's not connected to the Whitmore family, and he's not afraid of them, which is rarer than it should be. He paused again. He's done some work for people they've pushed around before, small things, but he knows how their lawyer operates. Clara lay still for a moment. You think there's a case? I think there might be. If you've got the original deed, if the will that Thomas made is somewhere it can be retrieved. The deed is... She stopped. I had a copy. I had it in the house. In the bedroom, in the box under the floorboard that she'd used for things she didn't want Gerald's household staff to find. She'd been meaning to get it out. She'd been putting it off because getting it out would mean deciding something, and she'd been afraid of deciding something. And then Victor had come to the room, and there hadn't been time for anything. It's still there, she said. Might be. If Gerald knows about it, Gerald might not know about it, Ethan said. He doesn't strike me as a man who thinks women plan ahead. That was so precisely accurate that she made a sound that was almost a laugh. No, he doesn't. So if we could get to that house and get to that document, we'd have something. We'd have something, he said. Not everything, but something to give to Aldous Heck and let him see if there's a way to use it. She stared at the ceiling. The cabin had gotten warm enough through the day that she could feel the cold only at her nose and at the tips of her fingers when she held them outside the blanket. She thought about the Whitmore house, the bedroom on the second floor, the east side, the floorboard that was loose under the left corner of the bed frame. She thought about Gerald downstairs in his study, Gerald who'd watched her with those polite, careful eyes for 3 weeks while he decided what to do about her. You'd go, she said. It wasn't a question. I'd go, he said. I know where the Whitmore property sits. I could go at night. That's a bad idea. It's not a good idea, he agreed, but I'm not sure we have good ideas available right now. She thought about it. She turned it over the way she'd turned over problems her whole life, not rushing to the answer, but holding the question up to the light and looking at its shape. Not yet, she said finally. They'll be watching. After the tracks you found, they'll be watching. If you go now and they catch you on their property, they'll have what they need to move against this place. Yes. A silence. The stove ticked. You think carefully, he said. I have to, she said. No one else was doing it for me. Another pause. Then he said, Fair enough. And she heard the shift of him resettling on the bedroll, and a few minutes later his breathing changed into the steadier rhythm of sleep. Clara lay awake for a long time after that. The snow had stopped. Through the small window she could see the darkness beginning to thin at the edges into the particular gray that came before dawn, and she lay still and listened to Iris and Rose breathe, and she thought about Thomas's deed with his signature on it, sitting under a floorboard in a house full of people who would prefer she was dead. It was there. She was nearly certain it was there. Gerald had underestimated her in so many ways, and this, she thought, might be the one that mattered. She thought about what Ethan had said, that this wasn't about her, not really, that she'd been easy to discard because women like her were always easy to discard, a thing that the people doing the discarding never had to say out loud because it was written into the whole structure of things, the way walls were written into a house. He was right, but he was also slightly wrong, in a way she couldn't fully explain yet, in a way she was still working out, because it was about her. It had to be about her, or she was going to turn into something she didn't want to be, into a piece in someone else's legal argument, a victim defined by what had been done to her, a woman whose 2 daughters were factors in a case about property rights. She wasn't going to be that. She wasn't entirely sure yet what she was going to be instead, but she could feel the shape of it forming, slow and hard and patient, somewhere in the part of her that had kept her alive through the fence post and the snow and 3 weeks of Gerald Whitmore's careful cruelty. The girls breathed. The stove ticked. The light outside the window went from black to gray to the particular cold blue that meant morning was coming, and the snow had stopped and the day would bring whatever it brought. Clara closed her eyes and told herself to sleep for an hour while she could. She was getting her daughters out of this. She was getting that deed out of that house. And whatever it took, lawyers, testimony, a judge in a courtroom looking at her scarred wrists, all of it, she was going to make Gerald Whitmore answer for what he'd done. Not because she was certain she could win. She wasn't certain of anything. But because the alternative was letting him believe that he'd been right about her. That she was the kind of woman who could be tied to a fence post in the snow and would simply cease to exist. She was not that woman. She wasn't entirely sure yet what woman she was. But she had a little time and a man who knocked before he came into his own cabin, and 2 daughters who were breathing steadily in the early morning light. For now, that would have to be enough. The snow melted unevenly, the way it always did on that particular stretch of land, gone first on the south-facing slopes where the afternoon light hit hardest, holding on in the shaded hollows, and along the north fence line where it packed down into something closer to ice. Ethan watched it go with the attention of a man reading a text he'd read many times, gauging what the ground underneath would tell him about the coming weeks. Clara watched him watch it and said nothing. 2 weeks had passed since the tracks on the ridge. Nothing had come. No riders, no men from Dunmore with papers, no word of any kind. The silence had a quality that was different from the silence of the first days, heavier, more deliberate. The kind of silence that wasn't an absence but a presence wearing absence as a disguise. "They're waiting for something," Ethan said one evening, not to her specifically, more to the air above the table. "For the snow to clear," Clara said. "Probably." He turned his coffee cup. "Or for something to arrange itself." She knew what he meant. An arrangement. Something legal-shaped that would give them cover for whatever they planned to do next. She'd been thinking about this too, lying awake after the twins went down, running the logic of Gerald Whitmore's mind the way she'd taught herself to run it over those 3 weeks in his house. He was not impulsive. He did not do things that could be turned against him if it could be avoided. He preferred moves that looked from the outside like the entirely reasonable actions of a wronged and patient man. So what would it look like from the outside, what Gerald did next? It would look like concern. It would look like a brother-in-law worried about the welfare of his late brother's widow, who had apparently been taken in by an unknown man of questionable character, along with Thomas's infant daughters. It would look like a family trying to recover what was theirs. "He's going to claim I'm incompetent," she said. Ethan looked at her. Incompetent. Mentally, emotionally, a woman in grief, not thinking clearly, in the power of a man who's taken advantage of the situation. She said it flatly, watching his face. "It's the cleanest play. It removes my testimony as a factor before I've given it. It gives him legal standing to petition for custody of the girls on the grounds that I can't care for them. And it puts you in a position where anything you say looks like the self-interested defense of a man who's been accused of something." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That's a careful piece of thinking." "I had a careful teacher," she said, "whether I wanted one or not." He looked at her steadily. She could see him working through the implications, following the chain of it. Then he said, "Aldous Heck, we need to go to him before they move." "I know. That means going to Dunmore." "I know that too. Can you ride?" She thought about her wrists, which had healed but not entirely. There were days when the right one ached with a persistence that she'd come to regard as just part of how she was now. "I can ride. The girls can't." "I know someone who might take the girls for a day. Woman named Nora Beale. She's got a homestead 4 miles east. She's got children of her own, and she's—" He stopped, like he was editing something. "She's not connected to any of this. Does she know me?" "She doesn't know anything about this situation. I haven't talked to anyone." He paused. "That'll have to change." Clara had understood this was coming. She'd been the one arguing for caution, for waiting, for keeping the circle small. But the circle couldn't stay small forever. Eventually you needed people. That was something she'd known abstractly for years and was learning in a more concrete way now. "Set it up," she said. He nodded. Then, "Clara, when we go to Heck, I need you to tell him everything. Not the shape of it. Everything." She looked at the table. "I know. The whole night, what they said, what they did, the specifics of the rope and the cold and where you were left and what condition the girls were in, all of it. It's going to be uncomfortable." "Ethan." She said it with a sharpness she hadn't intended, and he waited. "I understand what's necessary. Don't manage me." He held up one hand slightly. "All right." "I've been managing information my whole life," she said, more evenly. "Deciding what to say to Thomas and what would worry him unnecessarily. Deciding what to say to Gerald and what would make things worse. I've been performing the calculation of what a woman can say out loud without making things harder for herself since I was 17 years old. I know how to talk to a lawyer. He looked at her for a moment. I know you do, he said. I'm sorry. I was being useful in a way that wasn't actually useful. She exhaled. It's fine. It's not, but thank you for letting it go. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Nora Beale turned out to be a woman in her late 30s with red hands and an air of practical authority that Clara recognized as the particular kind that came from running a household in a remote place without adequate help. She had 3 children of her own ranging from 5 to 12, and she looked at Iris and Rose with the evaluating eye of someone who had seen a lot of babies and was not sentimental about them. They're small, she said. They were early, Clara said. How early? 6 weeks. Nora nodded, still looking at the twins. Mine came early too, the middle one. She glanced up at Clara. He's the difficult one. Rose is the difficult one, Clara said, before she'd decided to say it, and Nora laughed, a quick, real laugh that made Clara feel, for a strange, compressed second, like a normal person in a normal situation. Ethan had explained something to Nora before they arrived. Clara didn't know exactly what, only that when Nora looked at her, it was with a careful levelness that wasn't pity, but was also not ignorance. She knew something was wrong. She wasn't asking about it. Go, Nora said. I'll keep them. Don't be longer than you have to. Dunmore was not much of a town. Clara had never seen it, but she recognized the type. A main street with the necessary businesses arranged along it in the order of their necessity. The general store first, then the feed supplier, then the doctor and the lawyer sharing a building in the practical way of places too small for their own buildings. Then the saloon at the end in the position of something both indispensable and slightly embarrassing. The streets were mud. The mountains were visible to the north, sharp and serious. There were maybe 4 people visible, and all of them looked at Ethan and Clara with the attentive lack of expression of people who had not seen anything interesting happen in some time. Aldous Heck was a man of perhaps 55 with a brown suit that had been pressed recently, but not recently enough, and a desk that appeared to be actively losing a war with the documents stacked on it. He was shorter than Clara expected and had the eyes of someone who read small print in bad light for a living, and had made his peace with this. He looked at Ethan when they came in. Then he looked at Clara. Then he looked at Ethan again. Calloway, he said. This is unexpected. I expect so, Ethan said. This is Clara Whitmore, as in Thomas Whitmore's widow. She has a situation she needs help with. Something happened in Heck's eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like the expression of a man who had heard a sound he'd been half expecting and was now deciding whether he was glad it had finally arrived. Sit down, he said. Clara told him everything. She did it the way she'd told it to herself in the nights when she'd lain awake rehearsing it, in order, without editorializing, giving him the facts with the precision she could manage, and being honest about the places where her memory had been affected by cold and fear and exhaustion. Heck listened without interrupting. He'd pulled a piece of paper toward him when she started, and he wrote on it occasionally, small precise marks in the margin, but mostly he just listened. When she was done, the office was quiet for a moment. The deed, he said. You believe it's still in the house. Under the floorboard in the east bedroom on the 2nd floor, left corner under the bed frame. And the will, Thomas's amended will naming you as primary inheritor. I don't know where the original is. I had a copy, same location. A copy is better than nothing if it can be corroborated. He put down his pen. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it honestly because the answer changes what I can do for you. All right? Is there any possibility, that the deed or the will have been altered, or that there's a legitimate argument that Thomas's intent was different from what those documents state? She met his eyes. No. You're certain. Thomas and I talked about the land before he died. Not because either of us thought he was going to die. He didn't know he was going to die. It was a fever that moved fast. We didn't have time to prepare. But we talked about it when we were planning. He was explicit. He wanted me to have the acreage clear of the family holdings because he knew, she stopped. He knew his family had a particular relationship to property. He didn't say it that way. He said he wanted me to have something that was mine, something that Gerald couldn't get his hands on regardless of circumstances. Heck nodded slowly. He knew his brother. Better than I did, she said. Heck looked at Ethan. They'll come at this as a welfare matter first. The widow in an unstable situation, the children at risk, the concerned family attempting to provide proper care. He said this with a neutrality that was itself a kind of commentary. Before they file any legal challenge to the property, they'll try to remove her from the picture cleanly. If she's been declared incompetent, or if she voluntarily relinquishes the children, she won't, Ethan said. No, Heck said, but they'll try to create conditions where it looks like she has. A woman alone, no resources, dependent on a man she's known for 3 weeks. It's not a flattering picture, and they'll make it less flattering. What do we do? Clara said. Heck looked at her. A few things, and we need to do them before Gerald Whitmore's lawyer gets to the territorial courthouse first. He pulled the paper toward him again. First, documentation. I need you to write out a full account of the night you were left. Everything you told me, with dates, with the condition you were in, with specifics about the children. Ethan needs to write a corroborating account of what he found and when. If there's any physical evidence, the rope, Clara said. He kept the rope. Heck looked at Ethan. You kept the rope. I kept the rope, Ethan said, with the mild tone of someone who had known it might matter. That's useful. Heck made a note. Second, I'm going to file a preemptive claim on your behalf, establishing your legal standing as Thomas Whitmore's surviving spouse and the legitimate inheritor of the land parcel. It won't resolve the contest, but it gets our position on record before theirs. Third, he paused, the deed. We need that deed. I know, Clara said. Someone needs to go get it. Clara and Ethan looked at each other. It was a brief look, but it contained a conversation. I'll go, Clara said. Both men looked at her, Heck with professional concern. Ethan with something that was trying not to be alarm and was not entirely succeeding. Clara, Ethan started. It's my house, she said. I know where the floorboard is. I know which stair creaks and which door you have to lift while you open it or it catches. I know where Gerald's study is and what time he eats his evening meal and how long he stays at the table. She paused. You'd be going in blind. I'd be going in knowing exactly where everything is. You'd also be going in as a woman they left for dead and have been looking for since, Ethan said. Yes. She didn't look away from him. That's true. And if we don't get that deed, we're walking into Heck's courtroom with a copy and a story and the word of a rancher who had no reason to involve himself, against a family with a lawyer and a judge, and 15 years of connections in this territory. So, Ethan was quiet. His jaw was doing that thing she'd come to recognize, the small working motion that meant he was processing something he didn't like and testing it for any angle that would make it acceptable. There wasn't one. She could see him arrive at this conclusion. Not alone, he said. No, she agreed. Not alone. They went 3 nights later, which was as long as it took Ethan to work out the approach from the north that kept them below the sightlines from the Whitmore bunkhouse and the main yard. He'd ridden the perimeter of the Whitmore property twice in his life, once years ago in a boundary dispute with a neighboring spread that had been settled without incident, and once recently, since the tracks on the ridge, just to know the shape of the thing he was dealing with. He had a good memory for land. Clara's memory was different. It was interior. She knew the house the way you knew a place you'd been afraid in, completely, permanently, in the kind of detail that gets laid down when your nervous system is paying attention whether you want it to or not. They left the horses in the tree line behind the north pasture and went on foot. The night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that had retreated from the worst of winter, but hadn't forgiven you yet. The ground was frozen, and their footsteps were quieter for it. Ethan went first. Clara kept 3 steps behind and slightly to his left, the way he'd asked her to, so that if something came at them from ahead, she'd have a second of warning she could use. She thought about this as they walked, the fact that he'd thought about that, the spatial logic of it, that he'd put her where she'd have the best chance to run. She didn't know if she'd have run. She thought probably she would not have. The house was dark except for the study window on the ground floor where a lamp burned low. Gerald's study. He worked late. This was something she remembered, something she'd been half relieved about in those 3 weeks, because it meant she'd heard him still moving downstairs when she was trying to sleep, and had known exactly where he was. The kitchen entrance was at the back of the house, a wooden door that latched from the inside. Clara had noted, when she was still in the house and running her quiet inventory of possible exits, that the latch could be lifted from outside if you slid something thin into the gap at the top of the door and pushed down at the right angle. She'd never needed to use this information. She used it now. The door swung open with a sound that was too loud and then wasn't loud at all, just a small door sound absorbed immediately by the darkness inside. They stood still for a long moment. Nothing moved in the house. The lamp in the study threw a thin line of light under the door at the far end of the hall, but it didn't move. Ethan touched her elbow. She nodded and went in first. The kitchen was familiar and horrible in the way that places associated with fear and confinement become horrible in memory. It was just a kitchen, a large, competently equipped kitchen. There was nothing wrong with it in itself, but she felt her breathing change as she crossed it. She made herself focus on the stair. Second door on the left, past the china cabinet. She knew this. She went. The stairs were the risk. Old houses had opinions about stairs, and she'd cataloged these ones over 4 years of living above them. Third step, seventh step, the landing at the top where the floorboard by the window frame had a tendency to pop. She pointed these out to Ethan as they went, mute gestures in the dark, and he followed her pattern exactly. The east bedroom was at the end of the hall. Her bedroom. Hers and Thomas's, and then just hers in the months after. The door was closed. She put her hand on the handle and felt something pass through her that was not quite fear and not quite grief, and was perhaps just the sum of everything that had happened in her life, collecting in one spot at one moment. And then she turned the handle and went in. The room had been touched. She stood in the doorway and looked at it and knew it immediately. Not destroyed, not obviously ransacked, but reorganized. Someone had gone through the drawers. Someone had moved the bed frame 2 inches from its original position. She could tell by the marks in the floor. The marks that meant the bed frame had been moved and then pushed back, and whoever had pushed it back had not pushed it back to exactly the right place. Her stomach dropped. She crossed to the bed frame and crouched and ran her hand along the left corner and found the board and pressed it, and it gave in the right way. The boards were the same. She worked the edge up and reached into the space underneath. Her fingers found paper. She stood up with it and moved to the window where the moonlight came in and looked at what she had. The deed. Thomas's amended will with his signature and the witness signatures. Her copy of the letter from the Cheyenne lawyer that she'd kept because it was threatening enough to be useful. A document she'd almost forgotten about. A letter from Thomas to her, written when she was visiting Nebraska the previous spring, in which he'd talked about the land, about what he intended, in his own hand, in language so clear that it was almost like he'd known she might need it. She pressed all of it against her chest for 1 second, just one, and then she folded it carefully and put it inside her coat. They were back in the hall when they heard it, a sound from downstairs. Not the study. The study lamp had gone out while they were in the bedroom, which meant Gerald had moved. Movement in the kitchen. Ethan's hand came to her arm, and she went still. They stood in the dark hallway and listened to the sounds of someone moving around the kitchen below them. The sound of a cup being set down, the creak of the door to the back passage being opened, a pause. Then Victor's voice from somewhere below the back stairs. "Thought I heard something." A silence. Then Gerald's voice, closer, just inside the kitchen door. "The house settles. Go back to the bunkhouse." "I heard something, Gerald." "Go back to the bunkhouse," Gerald said again, and the flatness in it was the particular flatness she remembered, the one that meant the conversation was over regardless of whether it was resolved. Victor said something else, too low to make out, then footsteps moving away toward the back. They waited. 5 minutes, then 10. The kitchen stayed quiet. The house settled back into itself. Clara's legs were beginning to ache from holding still, and she made herself ignore this with the focused patience of someone who has learned what the alternative to patience is. Finally, Ethan moved his hand from her arm. She followed him back down the stairs, avoiding the 3rd step and the 7th, pausing at the landing, out through the kitchen and into the cold night air, and across the frozen yard and into the tree line. And they moved through the trees back toward the horses without speaking and without running, because running was the thing you did when you were panicking. And they were not panicking. They were moving with deliberate speed, which was different. When they reached the horses, Clara leaned against the gray mare's neck for a moment. Not dramatically, just allowed herself 1 second of something she didn't have a name for. The mare stood and permitted this. "You got it," Ethan said. Not a question. "All of it," she said.
The deed, the will, Thomas's letter. She paused. He wrote me a letter last spring. From the land, about the land. He describes it as mine in language it's very clear. It reads like he was afraid of something, even then. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, he might have been. I think he was. I think Thomas understood more about his family than he let me know, and I think he was trying to protect me in the ways he could think of without frightening me, and I think… She stopped. What? I think he didn't think it would be enough, she said. I think he knew he was building me a lifeboat, and he knew the lifeboat might not be enough, and he didn't know how to tell me that without taking away the thing that was working between us, which was that I believed things would be all right. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then, he sounds like a man who did what he could with what he had. Yes, she said. That's exactly what he was. They rode back to Nora Beale's in the dark. Nora met them at the door with the expression of someone who had been awake and not particularly anxious, but had wanted the waiting to be over. Both twins were asleep. Nora handed them over with the efficiency of a woman who'd spent a day managing other people's children and had opinions about the hour. The big one yelled at supper, Nora said, meaning Rose. Yelled until I figured out she wanted to be on her stomach instead of her back. Then she was fine. That's Rose, Clara said. I know what her name is. I'm just telling you what I know about her. Nora looked at Clara in the light of the doorway, a frank, assessing look. You all right? I'll be all right, Clara said. Nora studied her for another second and then nodded, once the way women sometimes settled things between themselves in half the time it would take to explain in words. They were back at the cabin before dawn. Ethan built up the stove and Clara sat at the table with the documents spread out in front of her and went through them in the firelight. She read Thomas's letter twice. His handwriting was familiar in a way that hurt, rounded at the tops of his letters, a little hurried in the way of someone who wrote quickly because his thoughts moved quickly. She folded it back along its original lines. Heck needs these in the morning, she said. I'll write at first light. She looked up at him. He was standing at the stove, his coat still on, holding his hands out to the warmth. He looked tired. She was tired too, but she found that her tiredness had a different quality than it had had before. Less like being hollowed out. More like the tiredness of someone who had done something and now needed to rest before doing the next thing. Ethan, she said. He turned. When I'm through this, when this is over, one way or another, I'm going to need to start thinking about what comes next. Where the girls and I land. She said it carefully, watching his face. I'm not assuming anything about this situation. I want you to know that. He looked at her steadily. Where are you going with this? I'm not going anywhere with it. I'm just saying it, because you've done more than anyone had a right to ask you to do, and I don't want you to feel like… She stopped, tried again. I don't want you to feel like I'm something you have to solve. He was quiet for a moment. The stove popped. Outside the sky was beginning to go from black to something slightly less black. Clara, he said, I stopped seeing you as something I had to solve about 2 days after you got here. She didn't know exactly what he meant by that. She thought she might know. She let it sit where he'd put it without picking it up and examining it, because some things needed to just sit for a while and be what they were. Get some sleep, he said. I'll write at first light. She started to gather the documents. And then she heard it. The sound she'd been dreading for 2 weeks. The sound she'd known in the back of her mind was coming. The sound that she had prepared for and still felt hit her in the stomach like something physical. Horses. More than 2. Coming from the South Road. Ethan was at the window before she was on her feet. He looked out for a moment, just a moment, and the set of his shoulders told her what he was seeing before he said it. There are 4 of them, he said. Gerald's in front. A pause. There's a man in a coat who isn't a ranch hand. Lawyer's coat. She had the documents in her hands. She looked down at them. Then she looked at Ethan. How much time do we have? 2 minutes, he said. Maybe 3. She thought very fast. She looked around the cabin, at the twins sleeping on the cot, at the stove, at the table, at the man standing at the window with his back straight and his hands loose at his sides. She thought about the fence post in the snow. She thought about Gerald's face at Thomas's funeral, the calculation she'd mistaken for grief. She thought about Thomas's letter in her hands, Thomas's clear, careful words setting out his wishes in language that couldn't be misread. She crossed to the stove and opened the small pot of grease on the shelf above it and slid all the documents into the gap between the back of the stove and the wall, into the space she'd noticed the day she arrived where the heat didn't directly reach. Not ideal. But the documents needed to be somewhere they weren't on her person when Gerald came through that door. She smoothed her clothes. She turned to face the door. "Stay behind me," Ethan said from the window. "No," she said, calmly and completely. "Stand beside me." He turned to look at her. She met his eyes and held them. He read something in her face and nodded once and moved to her side, and they stood together in the cabin where the twins were sleeping and waited for the knock. It came exactly as she'd expected. Not a pounding, not an urgent summons. 3 measured knocks, the kind that said, "We are reasonable people conducting legitimate business." Gerald had always had a gift for the form of things. Clara looked at Ethan. He looked at her. She reached out and opened the door. Gerald Whitmore stood on the porch in his good coat with his hat in his hand and his expression arranged into something that sat exactly between concern and regret, the face he wore when he needed people to believe that whatever he was about to do pained him. Behind him, slightly to the left, was a man in a dark coat carrying a leather case. Behind them both were 2 men she recognized from the Whitmore ranch. And behind them, on the road, a 4th man she didn't recognize sat on a horse and watched with the patient disinterest of someone being paid to be there. Gerald looked at her. His eyes moved very briefly to Ethan and then back to her, and she saw in that brief movement the recalibration, the assessment, the adjustment of his approach to account for the variable he hadn't fully planned for. "Clara," he said, "I am so relieved you're safe." She looked at him. 15 years in Wyoming, her children's father's brother, the man who had tied rope around her wrists while she begged him. "Gerald," she said, "you'd better come in." And she stepped back from the door, and she made sure her hands were perfectly steady, and she did not look at the gap behind the stove where Thomas's words were waiting to outlast every plan Gerald Whitmore had ever made. Gerald Whitmore came into Ethan Calloway's cabin the way he came into every room, ahead of everyone else, moving at the pace of a man who assumed the space would arrange itself around him. He looked at the cabin with a brief sweep of his eyes that took inventory without appearing to, the way he did everything, the mechanism always running behind the expression. The man in the dark coat followed him in. He introduced himself as Mr. Lyle Burchard, said it with the particular enunciation of someone who'd learned that clarity about names, reduced the number of times he had to repeat himself. He had a case that he set on the table with a small, deliberate sound, like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that hadn't been spoken yet. The 2 ranch hands stayed on the porch. The 4th man on the road stayed on the road. Gerald looked around the cabin again, and this time his eyes stopped on the cot where Iris and Rose were sleeping. Something moved across his face that Clara watched carefully and couldn't fully read. It was not warmth, and it was not entirely calculation either. It was something between those things, some complicated piece of business that Gerald himself might not have been able to name if asked. "They look well," he said. "They are well," Clara said. "I'm glad." He turned to her. "Clara, I want you to know that the past weeks there's been a great deal of distress in the family, about your disappearance, about the children." She looked at him and said nothing. She had decided, on the walk from the door to her current position, 3 feet to Ethan's left, that she was going to let Gerald build whatever structure he was building, and she was going to stay very quiet while he built it, because the structure would tell her things that were useful. Gerald had always talked more than he meant to when he thought the other person was too frightened or too confused to notice. "We had people looking," he went on. "I want you to understand that. When we realized you and the girls were gone from the house—" "Gone," Ethan said. Gerald looked at him. It was the first time he'd looked at Ethan directly, and Clara watched the 2 men take each other's measure. It lasted maybe 4 seconds and was conducted without expression on either side. "I'm sorry," Gerald said, with the courtesy of someone who is not sorry. "And you are?" "Ethan Calloway. This is my land." "Mr. Calloway." Gerald held his hat in both hands, unhurried. "I appreciate the Christian charity you've shown my sister-in-law in a difficult time. I want you to know the family is grateful." "That's not what happened," Ethan said. "But all right." Gerald's expression didn't change. He turned back to Clara. "I think we need to have a conversation about what's best for you and the girls going forward. Mr. Burchard has some papers." "I don't want to hear about the papers yet," Clara said. Gerald stopped. I want you to tell me something first, she said. I want you to say, out loud, in this room, what happened the night of January 9th. The air in the cabin changed. Not dramatically. This wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a quiet one, which made it more dangerous. Burchard's hand moved slightly on the case. Gerald's expression stayed exactly where it was, which took effort, and Clara could see the effort. Clara, Gerald said, and his voice had shifted slightly, moved into a register she recognized from those 3 weeks in his house, the register that said, I am being patient with you, and my patience has a limit. You were not well after the birth. You were confused, frightened. Whatever you believe you remember about that night, I have marks on my wrists, she said. You were delirious. I have marks on my wrists that are consistent with rope restraint, she said. Mr. Calloway found me tied to a fence post on the northern boundary of his property at approximately 6 in the morning on January 10th. My daughters were left on the ground beside me. The temperature that night was well below freezing. Iris has permanent minor scarring on her left ear from frostbite. She said all of this in the even tone she'd practiced in her head through 2 weeks of waiting, and she watched Gerald's face and watched him hear it and watched him decide in real time how to respond. Now, tell me what happened. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What I can tell you is that we are very concerned about your mental state. The trauma of losing Thomas, followed immediately by a difficult birth, these things affect a person. Mr. Burchard has documentation from a physician in Cheyenne. I haven't been to a physician in Cheyenne, Clara said. A physician who has reviewed the circumstances of your recent history and believes that you may be experiencing. A physician who has never met me, she said, reviewing circumstances as described to him by your lawyer in order to produce a document that says what you need it to say. She looked at Burchard. That's what's in the case. Burchard met her eyes briefly and then looked at the table. He had, she thought, the slightly ashamed quality of a man who was good at his job and occasionally found his job distasteful. Clara. Gerald's patience had reached its performed limit, and he'd let a little of what was underneath it show, just a little, controlled and deliberate. You are a woman alone with 2 infants in a stranger's cabin in the middle of nowhere. You have no resources, no standing, and no legal representation. What I am offering you today is a resolution to this situation that is dignified and private. You come home. The questions about the property are addressed reasonably. The girls grow up with the Whitmore name and the Whitmore resources behind them. And this, he made a small gesture that encompassed the cabin, Ethan, the general situation, is forgotten. Ethan spoke then, and he didn't raise his voice. She has legal representation. Gerald looked at him. Aldous Heck. Out of Dunmore. He filed this morning. Ethan looked at Gerald with the patience of a man talking about weather. I expect by now he's filed the preemptive claim on the property parcel, along with a corroborating statement from me about the condition I found Mrs. Whitmore and her daughters in on January 10th. And I expect by now he's also got some documents in hand that are going to make that physician's letter a great deal less useful than you were counting on. Something happened in Gerald's face. It was very brief and very real. The first real thing she'd seen from him. And it was not anger, it was something colder than anger. A recognition. The particular recognition of a man who has played a careful game and has just discovered that he is not the only careful person at the table. He looked at Clara. You went to the house, he said. That's my house, she said. That deed is under litigation, Burchard said quietly. Both of them looked at him. He had the expression of a man who had just decided to be professionally precise about something. The deed is currently under a litigation hold. If Mrs. Whitmore has recovered documents from that property, the status of those documents is, it's a legal question, Gerald, and I can't advise you that it's a simple one. Gerald looked at his lawyer with the look of a man who was discovering that even reliable instruments had limits. You can go, Clara said to Gerald. He turned back to her. You can take Mr. Burchard and your men and go back to your property, she said. And you can talk to your lawyer about what comes next. And whatever you decide to do, I want you to remember something. She took one step forward, a small step, but deliberate. I am Thomas's wife. I know exactly what he wanted, and I have it in his own hand. And I am no longer in your house, and I am no longer alone. And I am not confused or frightened or any of the things it would be convenient for me to be. Gerald looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the fence post.
She thought about the sound of his boots going away in the dark. "This will go to court," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll be there." He put his hat on. He looked at Ethan one more time with that same measuring look, and Ethan returned it with the equanimity of a man standing on his own land. And then Gerald turned and went out the door. Burchard followed him, case in hand, and as he passed Clara, he stopped for just a second. "The letter from Thomas," he said quietly. Not a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, a small, precise nod, and went out. They listened to the horses go. The fourth man on the road went with them, last to leave, and then the sound faded into the distance and the cabin was quiet again, and Iris woke up and announced this fact to the room in her preferred manner. Clara went to the cot and picked her up and stood holding her and felt something she didn't try to name moving through her in a long, slow wave. "That went better than it could have," Ethan said. "Yes?" she said. "And he won't stop." "No," he agreed. "But we've got something on record now, and he knows it. It changes the shape of what he can do." It did change it, but not as quickly or as cleanly as Clara had hoped, because the weeks that followed were not the neat legal process she'd constructed in her head during those quiet cabin mornings. They were grinding and complicated and exhausting in a way that was different from the physical exhaustion of the first days. This was the exhaustion of paper and waiting, and Aldous Heck's careful voice explaining what was possible and what was not and what would take time. The Whitmore family's lawyer filed a counterclaim on the property within 10 days. It was broad and densely worded and attacked the validity of Thomas's amended will on 3 separate grounds, one of which, a technical argument about witness signatures, was not entirely without foundation, and this was the one that worried Heck. He explained it to Clara and Ethan at his office on a cold afternoon, with the document spread on his desk and his pen tracing the relevant paragraph. "The original witness," he said, "the man who signed Thomas's amended will as the second witness. Do you know who he was?" "A man named Delbert Crane," Clara said. "He was Thomas's, I don't know exactly what to call him. He ran the books for Thomas's mother's property. He'd been there since before Thomas was born." "He's dead," Heck said. Clara felt something drop. "When?" 2 months after Thomas. Heart, apparently." Heck took off his glasses and set them down. I don't say this to alarm you. I say it because the Whitmore lawyer is going to say it, and he's going to say that without the second witness available to corroborate, the amended will's validity is in question, and he is not entirely wrong. "But we have the deed," Ethan said, "separate from the will." "The deed is stronger. The deed is very strong. The language is clear and the signature is Thomas's, and I've had it examined by 2 people who know his hand, and they both say it's genuine. The will question is about the land. The deed question is about Clara's right to make decisions regarding the land without the will as the underlying instrument." "I don't understand the difference," Clara said. "The land is yours either way. The question is whether you can act on it, sell it, develop it, deny access to it, without first going through the full probate process, which the Whitmore family's lawyer is trying to drag into territorial court, and which could take the better part of a year." A year. She thought about a year. She thought about the twins at a year old, which she could not quite picture, and about Ethan's cabin through another winter, and about Gerald Whitmore's patience, which she knew from experience was not short. "There has to be another witness," she said, "someone who was there." Heck looked at her carefully. "You know of someone?" She thought. She'd thought about this before, in the quiet of the cabin, running backward through the night. Thomas had come to her with the amended will. The night he'd been almost sheepish about it in the way of a man doing something he thought was necessary, but found slightly morbid. There had been 2 witnesses, Delbert Crane and someone else. Someone who'd been at the property that week helping with the spring fence work. Someone Thomas had pulled in almost casually, holding out the pen with an apologetic look. "There was a man," she said. "He was a fence worker. He came out from Dunmore for the spring season." She looked at Heck. "His name was, Thomas called him Eddie something. He had a burn scar on his right forearm. He told me once he'd come from Colorado." Heck wrote this down. "That's thin." "I know. But it's something to look for." He made another note. "In the meantime, the physician's letter that Gerald produced, I want to respond to that. I want to get a physician of our own to examine you, someone respectable, someone with no connection to the Whitmore family. I know a doctor in Dunmore named Walsh. He's got a good reputation, and he's examined cases for the territorial court before. He'll write something honest." "All right," Clara said. "It might be uncomfortable. He'll need to document the wrist scarring, the overall physical state, the fact that you are clearly a woman in possession of your faculties and your health. Some of what he asks you might feel, 'I'll manage it,'" she said. Heck looked at her for a moment. "I believe you will," he said, with a quiet matter-of-factness that was different from encouragement and meant more. She sat for Dr. Walsh on a Thursday afternoon in the back room of his office, which smelled like camphor and old wood, and the particular smell of a place where difficult things were regularly dealt with. He was a man in his 60s with a white beard and a precise manner, and he went about the examination with the focused competence of someone doing work he took seriously. When he looked at her wrists, he didn't say anything for a moment. He turned them both over and looked at them in the light from the window, and then he wrote something in his notebook with a small, controlled motion. "These were made by rope," he said. "Yes. Both wrists. The pattern on the right is more pronounced, which would suggest you were pulling against the restraint more on that side." He made another note. "How long were you restrained?" "I don't know exactly. Several hours, at minimum." "In freezing temperatures?" "Yes." He nodded. He wrote. He moved on, professional and thorough, and Clara submitted to the process with the patience she'd been building all her adult life, the patience of someone who understood that the forms and processes of the world moved at their own pace and could not be rushed by the urgency of the person they were meant to serve. When it was over, he walked her back to the waiting area where Ethan was, and he looked at Ethan with a directness that was slightly different from how he'd looked at Clara, more collegial, the particular shorthand of men. "She's in good health," he said, "which, given what she went through, is remarkable and speaks to her constitution. I'll have the written examination ready for Mr. Heck by Monday." Ethan nodded. "Thank you." Walsh looked at Clara one more time. "Mrs. Whitmore, what was done to you was not ambiguous. I want you to know that a medical examination says so clearly, and that will be in my report." She held his eyes. "Thank you, doctor." She was steady all the way across the street and into the saddle and all the way down the main road of Dunmore, and for about 2 miles past the edge of town, and then something let go in her that she hadn't known she was holding, and she pulled the horse up and sat for a moment in the middle of the road and breathed. Ethan pulled up beside her and waited. "I'm all right," she said. "I know," he said. "Take a minute." She took a minute. The sky was the kind of pale blue that late winter produced in Wyoming, washed out and enormous. The mountains to the north were exactly where they always were. "The fence worker," she said, when the minute was up. "Eddie. I've been trying to remember his last name, and I can't, but I remember he mentioned a woman in Dunmore. I think he had some connection here, a sister or a cousin." Ethan thought about it. "I can ask around. There are people in Dunmore I can ask without making it obvious what I'm looking for. Heck needs to find him. Heck needs to know he exists first." He looked at her. "You're sure about the scar? Right forearm, burn?" "Positive. He said he got it in a mine accident in Colorado. He was young when it happened. It covered most of the forearm." "That's the kind of detail people remember," Ethan said. "I'll start tomorrow." He found the connection 3 days later, through a man at the Dunmore feed store who knew most of the seasonal workers who came through the area, who knew a woman named Mrs. Agnes Pell, who had a nephew who matched the description, who had not been in the area for some time, but had been heard from the previous autumn from an address in the town of Harlow, 40 miles south. Heck wrote to the address. He wrote 2 letters on consecutive days to be certain one would arrive. He wrote in the careful, neutral language of a lawyer making an inquiry, and enclosed a note from Clara, which she wrote at the table in the cabin on a Tuesday night, while both twins were mercifully asleep, and Ethan sat across from her reading and not asking how it was going. She wrote to a stranger asking him to remember a moment that had meant nothing to him and might mean everything to her. She wrote it plainly and without appealing to his sympathy more than once, because she'd found that one appeal to sympathy was more persuasive than many, which was something she'd learned from watching Gerald work a room and had filed away as useful in a way he'd never intended. She sealed it and pushed it across the table. "It's done," she said. Ethan looked up from his book. He looked at the letter. "Good." He might not remember. He might not respond. He might have left Harlow. "Yes," Ethan said. "All of those things might be true." "You're not going to tell me it'll be fine." "I don't know if it'll be fine," he said,
But I know Heck has the strongest document you've got already, and he's got Walsh's report coming, and he's got my testimony. The witness would improve the position. It doesn't determine it. She looked at him. He'd said things like this before, not comforting exactly, but precise. Calibrated to what was actually true, rather than to what would make her feel better in the moment. She'd found, over the weeks, that she trusted this quality in him more than she would have trusted empty reassurance, which was something she hadn't known about herself before. "There's something else I want to do," she said. He waited. "I want to go back to the fence post." She watched his face. "I want Heck to bring someone out there, someone official. I want the site documented, the post, the marks in the wood where the rope was, the location relative to the property line." She paused. "I want it on record what was done and where." Ethan held her eyes for a moment. "That'll mean going back out there." "I know. It's on the boundary of Whitmore land." "I know that too. But the post is on your land, or close enough, and I want it on record." She looked at her hands on the table. "I don't want it to be something that just my word says happened. I want it to be a place, a documented place." He nodded slowly. "I'll talk to Heck about bringing the county surveyor and someone from the sheriff's office." He looked at her. "You think the sheriff will cooperate?" "I think the county sheriff has less direct relationship to the Whitmore family than the territorial court does. And I think if Heck approaches it as a property documentation rather than a criminal complaint, the sheriff has less reason to be difficult about it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since the second week," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that she could see the direction it almost went. They went to the fence post on a Friday with Heck and a surveyor named Grady and a deputy sheriff named Cahill, who had the manner of someone doing his job with neither enthusiasm nor resistance, which was, Clara had concluded, the best she was likely to get from law enforcement in this matter at this stage. She stood next to the post and showed them the marks in the wood where the rope had been and answered Grady's questions about the position of her hands. And the surveyor made his measurements and wrote in his record, and Cahill looked at everything and wrote in his notes and didn't say much. Heck walked the site with Grady and then came back to where Clara was standing. "This is going to help," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I need more than help." He looked at her. I was a man who'd spent his career managing the expectations of people in bad situations, and he had developed a carefully measured honesty about it that Clara had come to appreciate. "We have a strong position," he said. "I want to be clear about what I mean by strong. It means we are likely to be heard. It means the documentation we have makes it very difficult for the Whitmore position to be presented without challenge. It means Gerald Whitmore is going to have to defend what he did, rather than simply define what happened, which is what he's been doing his whole life." He paused. "It does not mean the outcome is certain. I want you to know that." "I know it," she said. "The territorial court has its own interests. Judges are people. Gerald Whitmore has money and connections and a version of events that he's had more time to polish than we've had to challenge." "I know all of that," she said. "What do you need from me between now and the hearing?" He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd seen from him a few times, the one that seemed to be reassessing something. "Patience," he said, "and that letter from Harlow, if it comes." The letter came on a Thursday, 3 weeks before the scheduled hearing date. It arrived at Heck's office, and Heck sent a boy to the cabin with it, and the boy arrived in the late afternoon while Clara was feeding the girls and Ethan was splitting wood in the yard. She opened it at the table. Edward Marsh, formerly of the Dunmore area, currently in Harlow. He remembered the Callaway. She caught herself, corrected inwardly, the Whitmore ranch, the spring fence work, the amended document Thomas Whitmore had asked him to witness. He remembered it because Thomas had given him an extra $1 for the trouble, which was unusual enough that he'd remembered it, and because the other witness had been an older man who seemed like someone who'd worked for the family for a long time. He remembered the document. He remembered his own signature. He could not travel to Dunmore at this time due to the demands of his current employment, but he was willing to provide a written statement, witnessed and notarized, attesting to his presence and his signature. Clara read the letter twice. Then she put it face down on the table and sat for a moment. Ethan came in from the yard. He looked at her face and at the letter on the table. "Good or bad?" he said. "He remembers," she said. "He'll give a statement." He put down the axe handle he'd carried in and stood across the table from her.
He didn't say anything right away, and she was grateful for that. Some moments needed a second before they were talked about. Clara, he said finally. I know, she said. It's not over. No, but that's a real piece of it. She nodded. She thought about Thomas with his pen and his slightly sheepish expression, standing in the spring light asking a fence worker to sign a document, doing what he could with what he had, trying to build something that would hold. It was going to hold. She couldn't be certain yet, but she could feel the shape of it, solid, documented, witnessed, real, not triumphant, not clean, just real, and on the record, and hers. She folded the letter from Edward Marsh and held it in both hands, and looked out the window at the yard where the late afternoon light was going orange and long across the snow. I want to take the girls outside tomorrow, she said. If it's not too cold, just in the yard. She looked at Ethan. They've never been outside in daylight. He thought about it. It'll be cold in the morning. Afternoon might be manageable. Afternoon then, she said. He nodded. He moved to the stove and she heard the sound of the kettle being put on and the ordinary sound of the fire being tended. And Iris was watching the ceiling with her usual expression of concentrated evaluation, and Rose had fallen asleep holding her own foot in a posture that shouldn't have been comfortable but apparently was. The hearing was in 19 days. Gerald Whitmore was going to walk into that courtroom with his lawyer and his money and his version of events, and Clara was going to walk in with Heck and Walsh's report and the deed and the letter and Edward Marsh's witness statement and the surveyor's documentation of a fence post in the Wyoming snow. She was not certain which of those things would win, but she was certain that the woman who had stood at that fence post and waited to die was not the woman who would walk into that courtroom. She was certain of that, and for tonight, it was enough. The afternoon before the hearing, Clara took the girls outside. She'd been saying she would do it for weeks, and something had always intervened. Weather, or a feeding, or the particular quality of exhaustion that came from 19 days of waiting for something you couldn't speed up. But the afternoon before the hearing, the sky was clear, and the temperature had climbed to something almost reasonable, and she bundled Iris and Rose into every layer they had and carried them out into the yard and stood in the pale winter sunlight and let them see the sky for the first time. Rose looked at it with her usual expression of suspicious evaluation. Iris went very still and her eyes moved across the blue with a focus that Clara found, irrationally, moving. She was 4 months old. She could not understand sky. But she looked at it like she understood something. Ethan came out of the barn after a few minutes and stood at the fence and watched them. He had a piece of tack he'd been oiling, and he held it without working on it. They're taking it in, he said. Rose thinks she disapproves, Clara said. Rose disapproves of most things initially. She comes around. Eventually, he agreed. She stood there for a while longer than she'd planned to. The light was going orange and the mountains were very clear to the north, and she thought about tomorrow, and then made herself stop thinking about tomorrow, and just stood in the yard with her daughters in the fading afternoon and let it be what it was. The hearing was in the county seat, which was larger than Dunmore, but still the kind of town where a proceeding like this one would be known about before it happened and discussed at length afterward. Heck had told her this without apology, because it was simply true, and she needed to know it. The Whitmore family was known. The circumstances were the kind that people talked about. She should be prepared to be looked at. She was prepared to be looked at. She had been looked at her entire adult life in the particular way that women in difficult circumstances were looked at, assessed, categorized, found wanting, or found pitiable, or found useful to whatever story the person looking had already decided to tell. She had spent enough time being seen through other people's frames. She was done with that. They rode to the county seat the morning of the hearing, she and Ethan, leaving the twins with Nora Beale again. Nora had become, over the past weeks, something Clara didn't quite have a word for yet. Not exactly a friend, not the way that word usually worked, but a woman who had decided without discussion or drama that Clara's situation was one she was going to be adjacent to, and who expressed this by occasionally arriving at the cabin with food, and sometimes by simply sitting at the table and talking about practical things in a way that asked nothing and offered something Clara hadn't known she needed. When they dropped the girls off that morning, Nora looked at Clara's face and said, "You'll do." "You don't know that," Clara said. "No," Nora agreed, "but you'll do anyway." The courtroom was a room that took itself seriously. High ceiling, wood-paneled walls, the particular smell of a building that housed paperwork and consequence. The public benches were fuller than Clara had expected. She recognized perhaps a third of the faces from Dunmore and its surroundings. The rest were strangers, or were strangers to her. Several of them were not strangers to each other, and she noticed as she came in that there were clusters of people who appeared to have come together, who were talking quietly and watching the door, and who went quieter when she walked in. She didn't know what that meant yet. She filed it and sat down next to Heck at the table he'd arranged on the left side of the room. Gerald came in 5 minutes later with Burchard and 2 other men she didn't recognize. He saw her immediately and looked at her with an expression that had been polished down to nothing, a controlled neutral face that gave away only the fact of its own control. He sat down at the opposite table and arranged his papers and didn't look at her again. Victor was not there. She'd wondered about Victor. She thought probably Burchard had advised against it. Judge Orrin Carver was a man of 60-something, with a gray mustache and the manner of someone who had heard a great deal of human behavior in this room and had developed a professional relationship with his own skepticism. He came in without ceremony and sat and looked at the room and then at the 2 tables and said, in a voice that carried without effort, "We're here on the matter of Whitmore property and estate, with associated welfare and competency claims filed by Mr. Gerald Whitmore and counterfilings by Mrs. Clara Whitmore, represented by Mr. Heck. Let's not waste the morning." Burchard went first. He was good. Clara had known he would be. She'd sat across from him in Ethan's cabin and understood that whatever discomfort he sometimes felt about his work, he was capable at it. He laid out the Whitmore position in careful, measured language that made everything sound like concern. Concern for a grieving widow, concern for 2 infant girls, concern about the circumstances in which they found themselves, and the appropriateness of those circumstances for the raising of children who bore the Whitmore name. He referenced the physician's letter. He referenced the complexity of the will and the missing witness. He was, Clara thought, doing the best he could with what he had, which was not nothing. Then Heck stood up. He was not a theatrical man. He did not build to things, or use his voice for effect, or arrange his papers with the performed confidence that Burchard had. He just spoke, in the direct way of someone who had found over a long career that the truth, given sufficient documentation, did not require decoration. He submitted Walsh's report first. He read the relevant sections aloud in a level voice and let the language do its work. The clinical description of the wrist scarring, the documentation of the frostbite on Iris's ear, the physician's professional opinion that the injuries described were consistent with prolonged restraint in freezing temperatures and not consistent with self-inflicted harm or accident. He submitted the surveyor's documentation of the fence post. He submitted Ethan's written account of what he had found on the morning of January 10th, signed and witnessed. He submitted Edward Marsh's notarized statement, which he read in full, and which was 2 pages long and contained the detail that had made Clara's hands go still when she first read it. That Thomas Whitmore, when asking Marsh to witness the document, had said words to the effect of, "I want this to be solid, I want there to be no question." That Thomas had taken the time to say that. That he had known, on some level, that there might be a question. He submitted Thomas's letter. He read the relevant portions aloud, and the courtroom was very quiet while he read. It was not a dramatic letter. Thomas had not written dramatically. He had written the way he talked, directly, in the slightly hurried script of someone whose thoughts moved faster than his pen, and he had said plainly that the land was Clara's, that it was to be hers regardless of circumstances, that he was putting this on paper because he wanted her to have something certain in a world where very little was certain. The room stayed quiet for a moment after Heck finished reading. Then Heck said, "I'd like to call Mrs. Clara Whitmore." She'd known this was coming. She'd prepared for it. She went to the witness chair and sat in it with her hands in her lap and looked at Heck, who stood a few feet away with his notes and his unremarkable brown suit and his careful eyes. He took her through it in order. The death of Thomas, the weeks in the Whitmore house, the conversations with Gerald about the land, the progressive constriction of her circumstances that she described in the plain, factual language she'd rehearsed, not reaching for emotion, not asking to be pitied, just describing what had happened and when and in what sequence. When he got to the night of January 9th, she felt the room change around her. The change you could not see, but could feel. The particular quality of attention that an audience gave to something they had not expected to actually hear. She described the night. All of it. Victor coming to the room,
Gerald's voice in the dark, the rope and the cold, and the sound of boots going away.
The silence when the twins stopped crying because the cold had gotten to them. She said all of this in the same level voice she'd been using, and she watched Judge Carver's face while she said it, and she saw something move in his expression that was not sentiment, but was not indifference either. When she was done, Heck said, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore," and sat down. Burchard stood for cross-examination. He was professional about it. He questioned the reliability of her memory on the night in question. He raised the physician's letter. He raised the question of Ethan's involvement and the nature of their arrangement. He did all of this carefully and without cruelty, which she thought was probably a strategic choice rather than a moral one, but she could not say for certain. She answered everything directly. She did not become flustered. She did not become angry. She answered each question with exactly the degree of specificity it required and no more. And when Burchard asked her whether she could be absolutely certain, given the cold and the trauma of childbirth and the grief of losing her husband, that her account of events was fully accurate, she looked at him and said, "Mr. Burchard, I have marks on my wrist that will be there for the rest of my life. I am certain." He sat down. Ethan was called next. He gave his account in the same way he did everything, without excess, without drama, with the particular authority of someone describing what they had seen rather than what they felt about it. He was a man with 15 years of standing in this territory. He was not connected to anyone involved. He had no obvious motive to fabricate or embellish. Judge Carver looked at him with the attention he'd been giving the whole proceeding and asked him 2 questions directly, which Heck had told her the judge occasionally did when something interested him. The first was, "Mr. Calloway, when you found Mrs. Whitmore and the infants, what was your assessment of their condition?" "They were dying," Ethan said. "If I'd found them an hour later, I don't think all 3 of them would have made it." "And in your judgment, was the situation consistent with an accident or with having been deliberately placed there?" Ethan looked at the judge steadily. The rope was tied in knots that take 2 hands to tie. Mrs. Whitmore's hands were bound. There's no account of an accident that explains those 2 facts together. Carver nodded and wrote something. Gerald was called. He gave his account of a concerned family, a confused widow, a situation that had been misrepresented. He was polished, but was credible in this way of a man who had spent his whole life being believed because he presented himself as someone who deserved to be believed. Clara watched the room while he talked and watched people watch him, and felt the familiar dread of understanding that some people would find him persuasive and she could not control that. But she also noticed the clusters of people she'd observed when she came in. They were listening to Gerald with the particular expression of people who had already made up their minds and were looking for evidence to confirm it, not to form it. She watched one woman in the 3rd row lean slightly toward the woman beside her and say something too low to hear, and both women looked at Gerald's back with expressions that were not sympathetic. She still didn't know what that meant, but it was something. Burchard's final argument was competent and polished and built the case for Gerald's position with professional care. When Heck gave his final argument, he was, as usual, not theatrical. He laid out the documentation. He named each piece of evidence and what it established. He made the argument that the documentation collectively formed a picture that was not ambiguous, and that placing the welfare of 2 infant girls with the family that had left them in the snow was not the action of a court acting in those girls' interests. Then he did something Clara hadn't expected. He paused, and he said, "Your Honor, there are people in this room who have asked to be heard." Carver looked at him over his glasses. "On what basis?" "They are landholders and residents of this county who have had dealings with the Whitmore family's land practices, and who believe those practices are relevant to the question of the family's character and conduct." Heck stayed very still. "Several of them have submitted written accounts to this court. I ask that the court consider receiving them." Burchard was on his feet immediately. Carver held up one hand without looking at him. "I'll receive written accounts," Carver said. "I won't turn this into an open proceeding. Submit them through Mr. Heck." Burchard sat down with the controlled expression of a man recalculating. Clara looked at Heck when he came back to the table. "You didn't tell me about this," she said quietly. "It came together in the last week," he said, equally quiet. 6 families. They have complaints about water rights, about boundary pressures, about some of the Whitmore family's methods of acquiring adjacent property. Nothing criminal, nothing that's been proven, but patterns. The judge will read them.
and they'll tell him something about who he's dealing with. She thought about those 6 families, people she'd never met who had their own grievances and their own reasons, who had decided that this proceeding was somewhere to put them, who had looked at her situation and recognized something of their own. She hadn't known about them. She hadn't asked for them. They had come anyway. There is something about that. She would think about it later, in the quiet of the cabin, turning it over. Something about the way that the world sometimes recognizes injustice, not because anyone organized it or planned for it, but because injustice accumulates, it settles into the landscape around it, and eventually other people can feel it underfoot. And when a moment comes where it can be named, it gets named. Not always, not inevitably, but sometimes. Judge Carver took the written accounts and said he would deliberate. He came back in an hour and 40 minutes. Clara spent that time sitting on a bench outside the courtroom next to Ethan, not talking much, watching the street outside the window where a woman was arguing with a man about something concerning a wagon, the ordinary life of a town carrying on in the way it did, regardless of what was happening in the rooms on either side of it. "Whatever happens," she said, at some point during the hour and 40 minutes. "Don't," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Don't do the thing where you prepare yourself for it going wrong," he said. "You can do that when it goes wrong, if it does. Right now, just sit here." She looked at him for a moment. "That's easier for you." "No, it's not."
"Not," he said. "I'm just better at looking like it is." She almost laughed. She turned back to the window and the woman and the wagon and sat there and tried to just be in the room. Carver's ruling was not everything she'd hoped for, and it was more than she'd let herself fully believe was possible. He dismissed the competency petition entirely, and without qualification, citing Walsh's examination and his own observation of Mrs. Whitmore's testimony. He ruled the amended will valid, citing Edward Marsh's notarized account as sufficient corroboration for the witness signature and Thomas's letter as supplementary evidence of intent. He transferred clear title of the 2,000 acres to Clara Whitmore as Thomas's surviving spouse and legal inheritor. On the matter of the night of January 9th, he said, "This court finds the testimony of Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Calloway credible and the documentary evidence corroborating. The actions described, if accurately represented, and this court finds reason to believe they are, constitute conduct that this court finds deeply troubling. This is not a criminal proceeding, and I have not been asked to rule on criminal liability, but I am making a formal referral to the Territorial Sheriff's Office to review the circumstances described in this testimony, and I am noting in the record of this ruling that the Whitmore family's conduct toward Mrs. Whitmore and her infant daughters on or around January 9th warrants that scrutiny." He closed the proceeding. The room did not erupt. It wasn't that kind of moment. There was a murmur, a shifting, the sound of people beginning to move and speak, and Clara sat very still for one moment in the middle of it. Heck put his hand briefly on the table next to hers. Not on her hand, next to it. A gesture of professional restraint that was also something more than professional, she thought. He gathered his papers. "It's not everything," he said quietly. "Gerald may appeal." "I know. The criminal referral is a referral. It doesn't guarantee anything." "I know that too." "But the land is yours," he said. "That's real, and it's recorded, and it's done." She nodded. She looked across the room at Gerald, who was at his table listening to Burchard. His face was controlled. He was already recalculating. She could see it, already moving to the next position. That was who he was. He would not stop being who he was because a judge had ruled against him. But he would have to operate differently now. He would have to operate as a man who had been ruled against, whose conduct was on record, whose family's practices had been named in a court proceeding with 6 families' written accounts attached. That was not nothing. In a territory where reputation was infrastructure, where who you were known to be determined who would do business with you, and who would extend you credit, and who would let their water access be adjacent to yours, that was not nothing at all. She rose, and she and Ethan walked out of the courtroom and into the hall and out the front door into the cold afternoon air, and she stood on the steps and breathed. "Clara," Ethan said, beside her. "I need a minute," she said. He gave her one. He stood beside her and let the minute be a minute, which was something she'd learned about him early and had never stopped being grateful for. The land was hers. 2,000 acres along the Greer River, with water access and winter grass, and the particular quality of Wyoming terrain that was brutal and specific and nothing like what she'd grown up with in Nebraska, and she had never once seen it except in Thomas's descriptions, but it was hers, and it was documented, and it was done. She thought about Thomas. She thought about his handwriting on that letter, the rounded tops of his letters, the slight hurry of his pen. She thought about him asking Eddie Marsh to witness a document in the spring light and saying, "I want this to be solid." She thought about the way he'd touched the back of her hand across dinner tables, not a grand gesture, just a placement. She thought about what he'd built for her and the fact that he'd built it imperfectly, because that was what people could do. Imperfect things that still mattered, structures that had cracks but held. She was not going to do the thing where she turned grief into something clean and resolved. That was not how it worked. She missed him, and she was angry at him sometimes for not seeing his family clearly enough to protect her better. And she was grateful to him, and she was sad. And all of those things were true at the same time and would probably continue to be. But she had his daughters and his land and his words in his own hand, and she was standing on a courthouse step in the cold, alive, with the documented legal right to her own life. She turned to Ethan. "I need to think about what comes next," she said. "The land, what to do with it." "You have time to think," he said. "I know, but I've been running from things for a while, and I'd like to start running toward something instead." She looked at him. "I'd like to see it, the land, when it warms up. I'd like to go out there and see what Thomas left me." "I'll take you," he said. She nodded. She looked at the street below the courthouse steps. A man crossing with a load of lumber, a child running ahead of a woman who was calling after her, a dog investigating something at the base of a post with the focused determination of a dog on a mission. The ordinary texture of a town's afternoon. "You know this is going to be complicated," she said. "The land, what to do with it, the referral, and what the sheriff does or doesn't do, Gerald possibly appealing. It's not over." "I know it's not over," he said. "I'm just saying, this isn't the end of the complicated." He looked at her with a patience that had never struck her as the absence of feeling, but rather as a particular kind of presence, a choosing to stay in the difficult thing rather than rushing past it. "Clara," he said, "I have been on that land by myself for 15 years. I know complicated. I'm not afraid of it." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she said, "I need to get back to the girls." "Yes," he said. They rode back in the late afternoon, the same pale light she'd stood in with the twins the day before, the mountains still clear to the north. She was tired in a way that went all the way to the back of her bones, and she thought she might sleep tonight in a way she hadn't slept since before Thomas died, the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone who has finished carrying something at least for one night. Nora met them at the door again. She looked at Clara's face and assessed it the way she assessed everything, quickly, without ceremony. "Well?" she said. "The land is mine," Clara said. "The competency petition was dismissed." Nora nodded once. "Good. Rose refused to sleep without being held, and I have 3 of my own, so that situation is between you and her from here on." She handed Iris over, then Rose, and then she stood in her doorway and looked at Clara one more time. "You holding up?" "I'm holding up," Clara said. "That's all you need to do tonight," Nora said, and went back inside. She held both girls on the ride home, one tucked against her in the carrier she'd sewn from Ethan's second-best blanket, one held carefully with her arm, while Ethan kept the pace slow and steady. Rose was awake and conducting her ongoing investigation of Clara's coat buttons with the intensity she brought to everything. Iris was asleep, and had been asleep since Nora handed her over and showed no signs of reconsidering this. The cabin was warm when they got back. Ethan had banked the stove before they left, and it had held through the day. She put both girls on the cot and stood looking at them for a moment. Rose still working on the coat button problem, Iris still resolutely asleep. And she thought about the fence post, which she thought about less often now, but still thought about, and about the cold of that January morning, and about the sound that had brought Ethan up the hill. A sound. That was what it came down to, at the beginning. A man who heard a sound and went toward it instead of deciding it was something else. She'd spent a lot of time thinking about why he'd done it. She'd asked him once, and he'd said he didn't know that he'd made a decision. And she believed that, because she'd seen him now, seen enough of him to understand that he was not a man who went toward things for reasons he could articulate. He went toward things because he was the kind of person who went toward things. And 15 years alone on a hard piece of land had not changed that in him, which was itself a kind of remarkable thing. She thought about what she was, now. She was a widow with 2 daughters and 2,000 acres and a property dispute partially resolved and a criminal referral that might or might not become anything. And she was in a cabin on a remote Wyoming ranch that belonged to a man she'd known for 4 months and trusted in ways she hadn't finished understanding yet. She was tired and her right wrist still ached sometimes when the temperature dropped, and she was nowhere near as certain about the future as she would have liked. But she had been certain of nothing on the morning of January 10th, and she was here. There was something in that she was still working out. Not a lesson exactly, because she was suspicious of things that packaged themselves as lessons. Life didn't usually cooperate with that kind of tidiness. More an observation. That the future she was in right now had not been the future she could have constructed from any prior position. That it had arrived through a chain of events that included the worst thing that had ever happened to her. And that those two things were connected, the worst thing and this thing, in a way that she couldn't resolve cleanly and was going to have to live with unresolved. What she knew was this: she was not the woman who could be disposed of. She had never been that woman, but it had taken being disposed of to prove it, which was the kind of irony that life seemed to enjoy and she did not particularly appreciate. She had been frightened, and she had been cold, and she had been tied to a fence post and left, and she had survived all of that and walked into a courtroom and told the truth. And the truth had been enough. Not because truth was always enough. It wasn't. She knew that. Heck had told her, and she'd known before Heck told her, that the world didn't run on truth the way it ran on water rights and money and the connections of men with long memories and longer reach. But this time, in this courtroom, with these documents and this judge, and those 6 families who had come with their written accounts of their own smaller griefs, this time it had been enough. She was going to take it. Ethan came in from putting the horses up. He looked at the cot where both girls had fallen asleep now, even Rose, and he looked at Clara standing beside it. "You should eat something," he said. "I know. There's food." "I know, Ethan," she said it gently. He nodded and went to the stove, and she stood for one more moment looking at her daughters. There was going to be spring. That was the next thing. Spring and the thaw, and going to see Thomas's land along the Greer River, and figuring out what to do with it, and how and whether it made sense to build something there or to hold it, and what holding it would look like. There was going to be the wait to hear what the territorial sheriff did with Carver's referral. There was going to be the ordinary sustained difficulty of making a life in a hard place. And there was going to be whatever this was, this thing that had assembled itself in this cabin over 4 months without being planned or asked for. This arrangement that had started as necessity and had become something else, something she didn't have exact words for yet and was not going to rush toward naming. She sat down at the table. Ethan put food in front of her and sat across from her, and they ate in the quiet they developed between them. The particular quiet of 2 people who had been through something together and no longer needed to fill the space between them with words. Outside, the night was coming down. The mountains would be out there in the dark, where they always were. The land, her land, Thomas's land, 2,000 acres along a river she hadn't seen yet, was out there too, under the snow, waiting for spring the way land waited, without urgency, with the patience of something that had been there before anyone who could want it and would be there long after. She was going to be all right, not in the smooth way, not in the way that meant the hard things hadn't happened, in the real way, the way that meant you carried the hard things, and they became part of you and you went on carrying them and you built something anyway, not despite the weight, but with it, because you didn't get to choose what you carried, only what you built. The fire held. The twins slept. Somewhere outside, the gray mare moved in the dark of the barn, restless the way she sometimes was in the evening, and then went still. Clara looked across the table at Ethan Calloway, who was finishing his food and not asking anything of her, who had gone up a hill 4 months ago because he heard a sound, who had stood beside her in a courtroom and told the truth in front of people who had the power to make his life difficult for doing so, who had knocked before coming into his own cabin every single morning since the 3rd day she was there. She picked up her coffee cup. "Thank you," she said. She'd said it before that first morning, and it hadn't been enough then either, but it was what she had. He looked at her. "You did the work," he said. "Not alone," she said. He held her eyes for a moment, and something passed between them that had the quality of a settlement, of 2 people arriving at the same place from different directions and finding each other there. "No," he said. "Not alone." Outside, the night was dark and cold and enormous, the way Wyoming nights were. The kind of dark that reminded you of how large the world was and how small any one life inside it. But the fire held. And the dark was just the dark. And morning would come, and there was land along a river to go see when the snow cleared, and two small lives asleep on a cot, breathing steadily in the firelight. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of everything, right here in this room, and Clara Whitmore held it with both hands and did not let go.